afternoon, everybody. Just to introduce myself before I do start, my name's Sarah Bate. I'm based down at Bournemouth now after completing my PhD at Exeter about 2 years ago now. And I looked at developmental prosopagnosia, particularly using eye movement measures during my PhD. And Brad was kind enough to come along and examine me at the end of it, which led to us starting a collaboration. And we're particularly interested in children with prosopagnosia and also in thinking about how we can actually go about rehabilitating this problem. So just before I start, you have to excuse me because one of my slides has corrupted, so I will just talk through that slide without it being there. I've gone over to Office 2010 recently, which seems to cause compatibility issues. So down at Bournemouth, basically, what my work's involved a lot over the last 1 to 2 years is inviting people in who think they have face processing problems and actually carrying out some initial diagnostic sessions with them using the dominant test that most of you will have participated in yourself. And then, if possible, I enrol people in one of our research projects. But one of the questions I always get asked is, well, what can I do about my prosopagnosia? And as a researcher, I think you often find yourself in this kind of slightly odd position where you're asking all these people to come in and be guinea pigs and to help you out with your scientific research. And actually, it's quite nice to be able to give something back and to actually say, well, this is what we're working towards at the moment, and perhaps, yes, we can actually help you while still informing our knowledge about the brain and about the normal face processing system. And looking at ways of treating prosopagnosia is actually an ideal situation to do that in. So these are the two main questions that I always get asked by people. First of all, are there any compensatory strategies I can adopt to help me with everyday face recognition? And we've heard some of those today already, from particularly from Joe's talk and from Monica as well. And then secondly, of course, is the key question, is there currently any treatment available? So to deal with the first question first, are there any compensatory strategies? Well, I thought the best people really to answer that question is people such as yourselves, people who experience prosopagnosia as part of their everyday life. And so what I did was I have an interactive website, which I'll give you the web address for, and we actually set up an interactive discussion forum. And the idea was that people with prosopagnosia could go on and take part in this discussion forum and actually share their tips with each other in looking at how we can actually go about softening the effects of prosopagnosia in everyday life. And I've just picked out a few here to share with you, and some of you sat here may well have been the people that posted these tips. What I usually do is say hello to everybody. These are direct quotations. I never use anyone's name because it could be the wrong one. I figured out the amount of people I can handle at the same time and only engage in activities that meet these criteria somewhat. I ask whoever happens to be next to me, who others are. I recognise people by the context I find them in, and that's one that we've heard several times today, I think, and by their personality. So this person gave the example of the happy guy near my area of the office would generally be my boss, for example. Someone else said, I recognise motion very easily. I often recognise someone at distance just by looking at the way they walk, and I know Joe specifically picked that one up earlier. And other people have talked about prosopagnosia in the workplace. What can we do to make life easier at work? One person was a student nurse, and she said that she had a notebook and made a note of any strong features that colleagues or patients might possess to help her with actually recalling that person. I thought this was quite a good one, the second one down. I always make very specific meeting arrangements and tend to be the first person there so that others have to find me and not vice versa. So that's quite a striking tip, I think. Tell everyone about it. That divides the responsibilities of recognising somewhat. Different people will have different emotions about whether or not they actually want to share their prosopagnosia with others, as we've already discussed. In a meeting or classroom, draw a plan of where everyone sits with names. So this is the web address here. So if you do have any more tips to add, or if you'd like to read more, do go online and add your own tips there. I'll just give you a second to scribble that down, so I see some of you writing. But what's quite striking about these everyday compensatory strategies, of course, is that they can and they do fail. So here's some direct quotes which really kind of hammer this point home. I rely very heavily on hairstyles, but obviously this falls down with any changes. I failed to recognise my husband in the swimming pool as his hair had washed back. He had to wave and shout to me. And then this one is, I think, is quite a nice quote, really, because it really does show those emotional consequences of prosopagnosia. And this person's saying, despite all these compensatory strategies that I try to use, still I frequently don't know who people are, and I run into a lot of issues around that. Seeing the disappointment in people's faces, finding that people think I don't like them or that I have a problem with them. And I can see a lot of you actually nodding as I'm talking here. So a very striking quote. And this really brings us on to the key question that I want to get to grips with today. And that is, can face processing impairments be treated? These compensatory strategies don't work all the time. So then, what can we do to actually bring about a lasting improvement in face recognition? Now, I am going to overlap with some of the literature covered by Ash earlier this morning, so I do apologise for that. But I'm going to take a slightly different approach and talk in a little bit more detail about some of these background studies. And what I thought would be useful for you all to gain from my talk is perhaps to see what has been done, the success, what was met with those different attempts to rehabilitate prosopagnosia. And then I'm just going to talk to you about a particular training regime that we're just about to start piloting. So, as Ash explained earlier, actually very little research has attempted to improve face processing in any type of prosopagnosia, whether that's people who have suffered brain damage or those who have had prosopagnosia since birth. A few early studies in the 1980s and early 90s did attempt to improve face recognition in some single cases of acquired prosopagnosia, but they actually met with very little success. And I'm not going to describe those in any more depth. What I'm going to focus on today is actually those successful studies. The researchers who carried out those early studies actually felt it's not surprising at all that we can't rehabilitate acquired prosopagnosia, given the complexity of the disorder. If you imagine if you've had a brain injury, it's probably not just going to affect that critical face processing area of your brain, which we heard about earlier. It's going to be a bit more widespread, and it's probably going to have a host of other cognitive complications alongside it. And those early researchers in the 80s actually just concluded, well, perhaps it's not worth us even trying to rehabilitate face processing deficits in this particular type of individual. And then, as we heard earlier, the late 90s, early 2000s, along came this awareness that actually there's a lot more people out there, such as yourselves here, who suffer from developmental prosopagnosia. And here came a whole new theoretical investigation, which we can go into whether we can actually improve face recognition in developmental cases. Now, this is the Powell et al. Study, which I'm going to start off with, and this is the one that Ash replicated in his particular study. So I won't go into much detail with this one to avoid overlap. But these authors, as Ash explained, tried to rehabilitate face recognition impairments in 20 patients. As Ash explained, these patients didn't have a pure prosopagnosia, so they had a host of other deficits going on alongside their face processing deficit. And they used 3 different methods. The semantic association, which is this one here, hopefully you can read that squashed up little bit of text, which hasn't come out too well. But what happened in this particular training method was the researchers provided the patient with additional information about the person. So biographical information such as their job, what they work as, what they like to do. The example here is, this is Anita, the policewoman whose camera was stolen from a fashion show yesterday. And what they were hoping here was that by providing additional background information about that person, it might actually strengthen the links to the actual facial representation itself. The caricaturing method, Ash provided us with quite a nice little morphing example of that earlier, where they just basically exaggerated those distinctive characteristics of the target faces. And the part recognition method was actually, again, bringing attention to specific distinguishing features of the face. So this is Sonia. She has a long face, a full lower lip, and dark eyebrows. And here's the data what Powell et al. Actually came up with. So when they applied these 3 training procedures to the learning of a set of new faces, what they found was much more accurate discrimination between the 10 study faces and 10 distractor faces after they completed each of the training tasks. So this was just what we call a control condition. Okay, so no training at all was applied to this particular face recognition test. This is your caricature, this is your semantic association, and this is your part recognition. What we're interested here is the black bars, really, which are our rehabilitation group. So those are our patients that underwent the actual training. The grey bars are just a control group of patients with very similar difficulties who didn't undergo the training procedure at all. And what was striking about this study was that in all 3 of the different training procedures, there was an improvement in face recognition. None of them seemed particularly to be any better than the other, but it did bring about some improvement in the ability to memorise new faces. So this study was actually quite interesting because it turned on its head that early data from the 1980s, which says we can't actually rehabilitate face processing deficits in people with acquired face recognition deficits. This study actually provides quite interesting initial evidence, it's just a pilot study, suggesting that face processing impairments can actually be improved. The authors also had the opportunity to test one patient with what they called a pure prosopagnosia. So this was someone who had suffered a brain injury, and they classed him as just having really a significant face processing problem in the absence of other cognitive deficits. And interestingly, that pure prosopagnosic only benefited from the part recognition technique, so when his attention was drawn to individual distinguishing features. The study was only a pilot study, and there was no longer-term follow-up data, so they were only tested on the day of the training. Okay. So what we need to know now really is were there any long-lasting effects of training? Did those effects hold over time? And of course, what about individuals with developmental prosopagnosia? And this brings me on to another study, which was published in 2007. And this study was actually carried out with a single developmental prosopagnosic, MZ. And what these authors did was they actually tried to take quite a different and a longer lasting technique, and they got the patient to undergo a training program which lasted over 14 months in total. And the patient was basically doing a series of very repetitive trials when they had to make very fine-grained perceptual distinctions between faces. So if you look on this little chart here, hopefully you can see the faces outlined in black are what they call category 1 faces. And they tended to have higher eyebrows and lower mouths. Okay. These faces, is the grey around them, were what they call category 2 faces, and they had the opposite, so lower eyebrows and higher mouths. And what the patients had to do was actually put all the faces that they saw, so these were just lots of repetitive trials of faces presented one at a time, and the patient had to classify them, were they category 1 or category 2. And what the authors were hoping was that this would actually improve their overall face perception skills and allow them to make these very fine-grained distinctions between different familiar faces. And they did find that their patient became better at face identification. So they carried out a number of actual face recognition tests, and they did note an improvement in the recognition of these faces at the end of the 14-month training period. Now, these graphs here look very complex, and I'm going to try to explain these in a much more simple way. But what was really striking about this study was not that there was just improvements in actual face recognition ability in this patient, but there was actually changes in the brain. So there was neural changes in the face processing system in the brain, which seemed to be underpinning this improvement in actual face recognition ability on the behavioural tasks. Now, I think we're going to hear a bit more about ERPs probably a bit later this afternoon, so I won't go into too much detail about that. But a lot of you here will also have participated, I think, in an ERP experiment. And ERPs are basically a psychological methodology that we use to measure the amount of electrical activity in the brain. So if one area of the brain is particularly busy, it lets off a lot of electrical activity. Okay, so if those key face processing areas are being used in a face processing task, they generate more electrical activity, and we can actually measure the magnitude of that activity. Now, in face recognition, it's thought that there are some very selective ERPs which only happen in response to faces. Okay, so for faces, there's a particular one which we call the N170, which basically happens when we complete a stage of face detection, if you like. Now, what was interesting about this particular patient was when the experimenter showed the patient pictures of faces on watches. This is what happened before training, so hopefully you can just make out this is the face line and this is the watch line. There's not really any difference in the electrical activity between those two different types of stimuli. Now, in control participants, we would see a difference. Okay, so we would see this, what we call face selective processing. But if we look at the second graph, after training, there's actually clear evidence of this N170 in our prosopagnosic patients. So you can see there's a clear difference in the graph lines here, showing that perhaps this patient has developed the ability to recognise faces, and those neural systems underpinning it have now become much more specialised towards processing facial stimuli. What was also striking was that the authors used fMRI techniques, so these are brain scanning techniques, and what they found was what we call increased functional connectivity between the different face selective neural areas of the brain. And this basically means that this network of different regions in our brain, which we think comprise the face recognition system, seem to be beginning to work together in a lot more efficiently, if you like, than what they were before the training. So this is a really key study, which provides really exciting evidence, because it not only shows, yes, we can perhaps improve face recognition in our developmental prosopagnosic patients, but we also see changes in the neural processing of faces, which is perhaps underpinning these improvements. Okay, I'm now going to talk about another study, and this took a completely different approach to improving face recognition in a developmental prosopagnosic, and this one was carried out with a child, so it's quite interesting again. It was an 8-year-old, I think it was a boy with prosopagnosia, AL, and what these researchers did was they gave the child a set of personally familiar faces, so perhaps his mother, his father, brothers and sisters, faces to learn at home, and they created a set of stimuli cards. Okay, so on the front of the card there was the actual picture of the person, and on the back there was a list of information about that person. So who the person was, how old they are, their gender, and then 3 pieces of identifying information. And these were picking up on distinguishing features, so things like small eyes, dimples in the cheeks, gaps in the teeth. And these were the instructions that the experimenter gave to the parents of the child, and this is how they actually went about the training procedure. So what the parents said was, we're going to learn about looking at faces and working out who they are. We are going to practice looking at some faces of people that you know. Remember, do not only use one thing to remember who the person is, like a beard, hairstyle or glasses. We need to use all the clues that we use in practice. So for each photo, the parent would say to AL, first of all, do you know who this person is? So at the beginning, AL would say no. And then they would give feedback to him, saying, yes, that's correct, or no, that's incorrect, actually this is so-and-so. And then for each photo, they would say, now how can we tell who this is, and how can we remember who this is? So it would be specifically drawing the child's attention to those distinguishing features. Now, I think the next slide is the critical one with the data on it that has corrupted. So I'll just summarise this for you. And basically what they found with the child was a notable improvement in face recognition that actually extended to a whole new set of facial photographs. And what they did was they tested the child with images, first of all with hair on them. So these were the faces of those personally familiar people. And then they tested the child with faces with the hair actually cut off. Okay? And what they found was an improvement not only just in those faces which had the hair and the external features that he could use to cue recognition, but also those faces where he only had the internal, that critical facial information available to him. And you might be interested to know that he actually completed the training procedure after 14 days. Okay? So what the researchers did was they said, after you have scored 100% correct on the training procedure, for 4 days in a row, we'll discontinue the training. And that happened after 14 days, within a 1 month period.
You said that originally it was 15 pictures. How many extra pictures were introduced?
So it was just, during the training phase, it was just, do you recognise this person?
It was just the 15 pictures?
It was just those faces. At the end, they then tested him on a whole new set of faces, okay? And they found that those effects were maintained during those faces, the presentation of those faces. So what might have brought about this improvement? Well, a similar study was then carried out a couple of years later by another research team. And this time they looked at a 4-year-old girl with prosopagnosia. And they carried out basically a very similar study, but this time they monitored the girl's eye movements before the training procedure and then again afterwards. And again they found that they had this success, okay, in training the child to recognise those faces. And before training, hopefully you can see the pattern of fixations from the eyes are quite distributed across the whole face. But after training, they're really a lot more focused on that critical internal region of the face, including the eyes. And the authors suggest perhaps this is what is underpinning those effects. So that's basically the key studies which have been reported so far. And we've had some more data today from Ash, obviously. But what we've got is we have promising early evidence that face recognition can be improved in both acquired and developmental cases. And this has important theoretical implications. Okay? Not only is it really important for practical use, but it tells us about the ability of the brain to recover or even to develop for the first time face processing skills at different points across the lifespan. What we really need to do now is carry out some much more extensive studies with larger groups of participants and more regular follow-ups. We need to know if these effects of training, okay, they might be there on the day that you test them and perhaps a week later, but will they last longer than that? Is there a critical age at which intervention might be more effective? Some people who investigate language processing would claim that there's a critical window where you can get in, if you like, with children with language processing deficits, where you're more likely to be much more successful in rehabilitating those deficits. Do we see the same in perceptual training tasks, such as those used in prosopagnosia? Is one technique better than another? We've seen a few different techniques today that might be used. And does this vary according to type of prosopagnosia? Would some techniques be better for our acquired patients and others for our developmental patients? And what about more practical issues? It's obviously very labour intensive to create a personalised training programme for each different individual with prosopagnosia. Perhaps we can look at creating some much more generalised facial training programs, which could be used by anybody who feels that they have the need for them. And this brings me on to my final slide. Is there currently a training program that I can take part in? Well, we will shortly actually be ready to run a training regime, which we're going to run through our website. And we're going to start off, first of all, piloting this with adults with prosopagnosia. And it's going to be one of these repetitive training regimes where you'll perhaps log into the website every day for maybe a 2-week period, and you'll take part in a series of trials which will aim to improve your ability to discriminate between different faces. If our programme is successful, we do plan to go on to make this publicly available, okay, so to let it reach as many people as possible and to create a version suitable for children. If you're interested in finding out a little bit more about this programme, please do either catch me today, look out for the lady with the baby bum, is probably the best way to identify me today, or do drop me an email. I've got some cards with me if you do just want to collect my details from me.
Sarah, can I just ask a question?
Yes.
The slide came up earlier with an address on it that people could put
the discussion boards.
Some of their ideas, strategies. I don't know if everybody got that down, that address. I saw some people frantically scribbling.
Shall I go back?
Yeah. Well, perhaps. And if anybody really wants it, perhaps you could forward it to me.
Of course,
and
yeah.
If anybody could email me on chat and we can forward that address on.
It's just Prosopagnosia research.com. I
Dot
can find it.
Yeah, and then there'll
So
be
that
a
was
link
the site where you can put your own ideas about different strategies.
There's an
you might have
awful lot.
developed.
There's an awful lot of posts up there. I've just
That's
this one here.
So
Yeah.
anybody, I
So if
think
you
that's
just go to the main
you
website.
might find some tips on there as well.
The other thing that I should add, we've actually set up a new discussion forum which is talking about Monica's group, and if anyone does have any ideas that might help Monica with her support group, they can also log in on a different thread and actually post those ideas there, and myself and Monica are monitoring those to see what feedback we can get from people. Okay.
Thanks very much.
We have the chart showing electrical activity,
Yeah.
and sure, in the article you've got a distinction between face and non-face inputs that you didn't have before. But what struck me was the behaviour for face inputs was almost the same before and after, and what had really changed, apparently, was the behaviour on non-face inputs. Is that a valid comparison?
Let's just go back to that slide. This data.
Well spotted. Yes. What we're doing when we're doing these kinds of things is really looking at the difference. So the absolute response of the brain can be due to all kinds of things. Could be an unspecific training effect, could be more motivation, it could be excitement or whatever. So what we're really interested in is to see whether there is a differential response, basically more activity to faces as compared to non-faces. So we take the brain response to watch in this case as the baseline, and then see, is there something more going on for faces? And that's what we want to see.
So if you do test, retest, PM170, is that like a change or a difference?
It really depends on the context. If people, for example, get more motivated, the best way to motivate people in these experiments is to give them money. So, or to promise them money for good performance. And if you do that, you actually see that all components come in.
What happens when proof comes in, they don't get the money?
Yeah, that's right. So that's not really what we're interested in, because if all go up, then this is not face specific. So we really want to see what's different about faces.
Hello.
Hi. When you're picking the three characteristics of the photograph of the person, do you pick them or does the child pick them?
In that study, I believe the researchers picked them. I don't think they were picked by the child before.
So there are specific areas that the researcher will say, yes, concentrate on the eyebrows.
Yeah, so they look at that individual photograph and they assume they will decide. I don't think that the actual process.
So the child might actually have another.
Yeah,
area.
sure. Yeah. I'm not 100% on the answer with that one. But
On your last slide, when you talked about the online thing that you were doing, is that for just developmental prosopagnosia or
no, for anybody. To start off with, what our plan is to pilot this. So we want to retain quite tight control over who would be participating. And what would be really nice is if we can get a developmental group and an acquired group. And within both of those categories, we also think there's perhaps different subtypes of prosopagnosia. So the classic one in acquired prosopagnosia is we think some people are just looking at faces differently, and that has a knock-on effect of meaning, well, if you're looking at something in the wrong manner, then of course you won't recognise it. Other people have what we call more of an associative impairment, and they're looking at faces in the correct manner, but for some reason they're not actually able to access those facial memories. Now, it's possible those two subtypes might also exist in developmental cases, but that remains to be seen. So what would be really nice is to have a developmental group, some who have problems in facial perception, some who don't, and our acquired group as well with both of those. And then we can then move on to the actual children and looking at if there's an age effect. Is there a critical age or a window, if you like, where we can get in there and have the most chances of success?
Can I make it a quick one?
Yeah, just a point with reference to the earlier question that in our study with part recognition, we did find that the things that we used as eyebrows or whatever, the prosopagnosia people actually said that wasn't the bit that I would have noticed. So there's a real thing about what we as scientists choose as the features and what a prosopagnosia is looking at.
So it's interesting, it's something perhaps we need to take into account in our...
Right, so if anyone else has got any other questions...